We moved to Westport, my husband and I, and our two older children were 5 and 3 years old at the time, in 1955. And I think, I'm not sure of the date, but I think I very quickly joined the League. I just made wonderful friends in the League. And more than that, I became totally, deeply committed to the League. I think it became as important to me in those years as my family.
Okay, I joined the League in 1958, and I found that it was the most important thing I ever did because my brain just wasn't working anymore, or hadn't been.
My daughter had been born, and one of my friends lived on the street, and they kept begging at me, and they offered child care. So I brought my daughter along with me down to the end of the road. I took her there to the meetings, and she slept away, and I got babysitting, so to speak, and I got involved with the League.
I first joined the League 51 years ago, and I knew the League of Women Voters was a good organization because a friend of mine in college said you should always support the League of Women Voters.
I was bamboozled by Sarah Hers. I played tennis and with Sarah, and I was complaining about this, that, or the other thing about the town of Westport, and Sarah said, you ought to join the League of Women Voters, and she all but forced me to join. Once I got in it, I loved it.
I joined the League way back in the end of the 60s. I was new to town. I had moved to town in 1965, and I knew I needed to know more about the town. So what better place to learn than to join the League? And it was a wonderful experience.
And I wanted to know a little bit about Westport and become slightly involved. And I was a fairly political person, so I joined the League, which seemed to be a dynamite operation at that point.
My mother, who lived in Fairfield, and I grew up in Fairfield, was always a member of the local League, and she always said, when you reach that place in life where you want something interesting to do, take a look at the League of Women Voters.
I was tipped off by someone, I think in a bank, who told me, you will meet your intellectual equal in Westport. And, you might start thinking about some of the groups in town. And she rattled off the League of Women Voters. And I thought, well, now there's a group that's really not concerned so much with what they're wearing to the meetings as to what they're thinking about in the meetings.
In October 1949, several members of the newly formed Provisional League of Women Voters of Westport held their first meeting at the home of Mrs. Walcott Street on Myrtle Avenue. Over tea, they elected Mrs. John Montserrat as their first president.
The League started in 1949, and I think it actually, in those days, in order to start a league, you had to start it around an issue. And I think the issue then was that the town did not have a charter, and the League saw a need for a charter for the town of Westport, and were very, very active in getting that finally put through.
Almost immediately, the Westport League became active in publicizing and promoting the recently created Representative Town Meeting. They observed existing RTMs in neighboring towns, wrote letters to the editors of local newspapers exhorting Westporters to run for this new office, and published their first voter's guide, providing background on the more than 120 candidates who did eventually come forward in the first RTM election. The newly formed league didn't limit itself to voter education. As the new RTM held its earliest meetings, the League was there to offer several suggestions. These included calling for RTM votes to be conducted by roll call so that citizens could know how their representatives had voted, and recommending that the moderator submerge his own opinions so that a fair, complete review of the facts may be ascertained by the representatives. As League women gained experience, they began to interact more directly with town government. From their early days of observing the RTM, they expanded their influence to other boards and commissions. And, in the case of Barlow, Cutler, Wotton, to actually founding one.
Barlow Wotton had been a major force in creating the Conservation Commission during the 60s. And in fact, I think she should be given full credit for that. She started the agitation about it. She got people with some power to be interested in it, and she saw the creation of it.
I was on the RTM representing my district, District 2, and a committee was formed to basically by Ralph Sheffer to look into the reason why we didn't have a Conservation Commission. I knew why the reason was, because both Don Bremner, our planner in town, and the first selectman were dead set against it. They didn't want to share any power. We had the committee and we brought in the report to the RTM, which definitely said we should form the committee. And actually we found in the enabling legislature of the state of Connecticut that the moderator or the RTM could actually appoint a committee. So we went over the first selectman's objections and appointed a committee of the first Conservation Commission.
After working with Ralph Sheffer to found Westport's Conservation Commission, Barlow then formed the Aspetuck Land Trust.
She was just always engaged in what was going on. Wetlands, laws, land use, and as you know, she started the Aspetuck Land Trust all by herself and then got people engaged in it.
I have been doing all this work with the state. The state said you really ought to have a land trust to back up the power of the Conservation Commission. So basically we had this meeting and we went from there to form the Aspetuck Land Trust. And we called it the Aspetuck Land Trust because if you look at a map you'll see the river, Aspetuck River, comes down from Easton through Westport and Weston and Fairfield. So all 4 towns are really right there. So basically that was the beginning of the Aspetuck Land Trust.
Founded by Barlow in 1966, the Aspetuck Land Trust now preserves and protects over 1,700 acres of land in the 4 towns. Barlow was just one of many League women in Westport who took an active role in public life and who were empowered by their League training and experience.
So many of the women who have been really leaders here in Westport got their start in the League of Women Voters.
The League was my graduate school, and that it really taught me a tremendous amount, certainly about issues, certainly about how you spoke in public, because it gave you a training ground to be able to do, and a structure to be able to do it.
And I would say I've learned so much about running an organization, but at the same time, it was basically the study committees of the League give you the basic foundation that you need for researching problems and bringing them to the foreground.
They learned how to organize. They learned how to speak if they didn't already know. They learned how to work with people. They learned about presenting issues.
The whole background of the League, of knowing how to go about organizing people and so on, was invaluable, absolutely invaluable.
There was a woman here who still lives in Westport, Selma Bunks. She is now called Selma Miriam. But Selma did training sessions for unit leaders, for study group leaders, on how you organize, how you lead a group, how you give everybody a chance to speak as you're trying to get we used to call it coming to consensus. And that's a very good phrase, because what that says is it's not just something that happens, it's a process that you move toward.
I really liked league process very much. And, you know, coming to consensus was very hard, as Obama's found out now, you know. And there's places where there is no consensus, and that's a conclusion also, you know, that there is no consensus. But we would try very hard, and that was the unit leader's job.
What it does is allows you to learn how to be a public speaker, learn how to be attentive in meetings, learn how to share your opinion rather than force your opinion, learn how to listen to your fellows to understand a different point of view, and how to respect people who are coming from places that you could not have imagined. And then, with all of those differences, the League gives you an opportunity and an avenue to find agreement.
That was the kind of thing that the League taught me so well to do, is to get your contacts, get your facts straight, give it coherently, don't be strident, make sure you have the backup, and then present it the way it is, and then lobby for it.
I think the League impact has been they've empowered women to realize what they can and can't do. And when they've been elected to office, some of them say, oh, I can't do that, I can't speak in public, but they can.
You were heavily encouraged by you, I mean, women in the League who showed an interest, who took board positions, who took certain responsibilities and seemed to be able to do all that, were then encouraged to go to the next step. It was happening fast. But the people that were doing it were really terrific. It was really super.
In the late 1960s and early 70s, women everywhere were becoming more confident in their leadership potential. And in Westport, they only needed a spark plug to make the move onto center stage and compete directly for political office. And the League was the natural place to find women who were ready to move from the wings and take on this new challenge.
The National Women's Political Caucus appeared on the front page of the New York Times sometime in the late 60s, probably 68 or 69. Gloria Steinem, Flo Kennedy, Bella Abzug, and Shirley Chisholm. And that just was another event that, oh my God, why haven't we done this before? I got very excited about that, joined it immediately, and then I said, why don't we start a women's caucus of Westport? Why aren't women engaged in running for public office in Westport? Why is it only the men, or if the first selectman happens to appoint a woman? And so I put a little notice in the paper, and I would say over 80 women appeared that night. They were parked on the lawn and all over, and I thought this was sort of a great transformation where women were united.
All of these League women, you know, who were just ahead of Marty and me in the League leadership, decided to sort of take over the town. They all ran for office at the same time.
I think the League felt the town needed help in the government, that the town was not always performing in the way they wanted it to perform. Pat Copeland ran because the way she was an observer for the ZBA. And when she saw what they did, the courthouse was above the police station. And that's where they went for their meetings were.
Yeah,
that's correct.
where we held our meetings.
And you would go to the courthouse meeting, and it would be in the afternoon, and there'd be not enough members of the ZBA, so they'd pull somebody out of the audience to be one of the 5 members. And Pat used to tell me this story, I don't know how many times, and then the developer would get up, or the builder, and he'd come up with an envelope, and on it he'd have sketched where he wanted to put his house. And he said, I'm a little bit over the setback. He said, but I just need a little bit of a variance. There were no maps, no nothing. And Pat was just horrified at this whole thought that was going on, and they'd give him a variance based on a little sketch on an envelope. And Pat got madder and madder and madder, and that's why she ran. And she was going to straighten those guys out come hell or high water.
No, yeah, I complained, playing tennis with Sarah Hurst is one of my backgrounds, and Sarah, and I started to complain about what the ZBA was doing on Imperial Avenue, and I complained, and I named some names of people on the board who I thought were really giving away all the zoning. And Sarah said, for God's sakes, Jackie, you know what, you ought to run. You know more about it than anybody. She said, I'm going to go to the town committee and get them to run you. Well, they didn't want to. Who the hell is Jackie?
Who is she?
She has never licked a stamp. She's never
Right.
showed up at Democratic headquarters. But she insisted, and they had to interview.
The women who were nominated, Pat Copeland, Jackie Henage, were nominated to run for the Zoning Board of Appeals, got the Democratic Town Committee to interview them, and they were willing to run. And June Lurie ran for the Board of Tax Appeals.
I remember when Pat ran, that both parties were not terribly happy with women running anyway. And I think neither one of you, Pat or you, got much help from the parties.
I devised an idea of promoting them that rankled everyone in town. I took the women and and contacted the Rotary and all the service organizations and promoted them alone.
The women got together, and both the Republican and Democratic candidates went through town, and we spoke everywhere as a group of women. We spoke everywhere from the Assumption Church to Temple Israel. We also did our own separate campaign for the office for the party that we were running for, but we worked together as a team of women running for office. And it was a very rewarding experience. And most interesting, women came up to me in the supermarket dragging their little daughters along saying, "Meet this woman, she's running for public office."
Jackie Henage was elected to
ZBA first.
Was ZBA first?
And then first selected.
Because it was
yes.
Ann Gill
Yes.
and Mary Borden and Char Belzer were all on the Planning and Zoning Commission. And Julie
well.
and Pat Copeland. And Mary Jenkins. I think Mary was on the P&Z first and then was for many years moderator of the RTM. So all of these women who had been kind of working behind the scenes on issues decided to put themselves forward, and decided they knew how to run the town better than whoever was doing it at the time. And they all ran for office and they won.
Shortly after the first woman stood for election, and a few years after Barlow's success in founding the Conservation Commission, another league president took on a different aspect of land use. Julie Balaga became the first woman to serve as chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission.
I was by then the president of the league, and this was in the early 70s, and there was a proposal that came to the town to sell Hales Court. Now, Hales Court at that time was the only place in town that we had any moderate income housing at all. And the board had studied housing in town, had felt that there was a need for alternative housing styles, and we said, if they sell Hales Court, we'll have nothing then. It will go into the market, the prices will escalate, and we'll make it impossible for moderate income families to stay in Westport. And so I testified that night, and you helped me write my speech.
Oh.
And because I was like, what am I going to say? And I remember giving that speech. At the time, I was nervous, and I made my testimony. I knew it was good testimony. It had been vetted by the whole board, and we were all very comfortable with it. And I went home, and I was awakened the next morning by then First Selectman John Kemish, who said he was in the audience that night, and he saw me and said, there's an opening on the Planning and Zoning Commission, Julie. Would you be willing to have your name put forward? And I was dumbstruck, and I said, well, it's better to be on the board than to petition the board. And so I talked to the board of the league, and I said, what do you think? I think I ought to go on it because I can really make a difference. It'd be more impactful to be on the board. When I got appointed to the Planning and Zoning Commission, remember it was appointed in those days. 5 weeks into the term, the guys elected me chairman of the commission. The very first meeting, they had the election, they elected me chairman, and Manny Margolis said, okay guys, I'm making the coffee, Julie will run the meeting.
I took over the job of fetching the coffee and pouring it. I said to Julia, I'll pour the coffee, you run the meetings.
In those days, that just wasn't said. It set the tone for that commission. I was in charge, and they all respected that.
As Julie took over as chairman of the P&Z, the town was also in transition, and she found herself leading the commission through the contentious process of rezoning to allow apartments.
Probably the most controversial thing we dealt with when I was on the Planning and Zoning Commission was the whole question of what in those days was called multiple family dwellings. It was condominiums or apartments. We had, at that point in Westport's history, there wasn't a single multiple family dwelling in this town except illegal apartments, right? They were there, we knew they were there. So we worked very hard proposing a zoning code that would allow for multiple family dwellings. Oh, it was so controversial. You would have thought we were killing everyone's first child. My husband and I stopped going to parties because people would pummel me. They were so angry about it.
The Planning and Zoning Commission, again under the leadership of Julie Balaga, passed an ordinance that allowed for multifamily housing in Westport. We had public hearings like you wouldn't believe.
And we really hung tough. The proposal that we eventually proposed was overturned by the RTM. And I felt really saddened by that, but we went back to the drawing board and we continued to work, and then after I left, they did in fact allow for condominiums. And you know, I think about it a lot. Every time I go by Harvest Common or I go by the other really gorgeous condominium complexes in this town and think, did that really degrade Westport? Of course not.
Julie went on to serve 10 years in the Connecticut House of Representatives, and in 1986, she ran for governor. In 1990, she was appointed the New England Director of the Environmental Protection Agency by the first President Bush, and was later appointed by President Clinton to the Export-Import Bank. In 1973, Westport reached another political milestone with the election of a woman as the town's first selectman.
I had really won very big for a Democrat in Westport when I ran for the Zoning Board of Appeals, all right? I apparently got a lot of votes. And so the Democratic Party came to me 2 years later and said, we want to run you for first selectman. And I said, go away. And I knew they had two men who wanted it very badly, and both perfectly qualified men.
I can remember sitting out in my driveway talking to Jackie and saying, you know, you've really got to do this. You will be so great.
They went away and left me alone, and then they came back and they said, all right, Jackie, you don't want to run, but will you come and talk to the committee that's supposed to pick who's running and tell them what kind of a person we ought to pick. At the end of that meeting, I knew I could run the town of Westport. And they said, you know you're going to lose, but we want you to talk about the town the way you talk to us. And of course, I was talking all the positions when I was telling them what should be done about the town.
I was talking to the chairman of the Democratic Party and saying, why in the world did you ever run a woman for first selectman? Obviously, you knew you weren't going to win.
She was running for first selectman. She was no way going to win. And she won.
I won, and I won big. It wasn't even close.
I just remember the night she was elected. Oh my goodness, we were so excited. And we had a great party afterwards to celebrate.
And when she won, she called me the next morning and she said, I can't pick my daughter up at gymnastics. Not to worry, Jackie. I said, I'll pick your daughter up at gymnastics.
When Jackie was elected first selectman, that she went into seclusion for a couple of days because she was so shocked that she had won. Mm-hmm. Because the Democrats had asked her to run, they needed a candidate.
It was a great night.
Yeah, you were there.
It was just a great night.
Jackie's election proved that Westport was ready for women in power, and as the town changed and grew, more and more League women came forward to run for political office. Land use was one area in which they chose to make their voices heard.
The planning and zoning intrigued me because I wanted to run for office. And I originally was thinking of the Board of Finance, and then I decided that wasn't going to be my forte. And then they were looking for 7 members to run for the Planning and Zoning Commission because it was going to be elected for the first time. So I got on the 2-year term one and ran with Pat Copeland and some of the other friends. And we had a very good time on the P&Z. It was an interesting period of time for the town. Well, we were a very busy board, that's for sure. One of the first things we did was to rewrite the regulations. The regulations when I came on board were about this thick. They're now about this thick. And I think we made the town better. Planning and zoning, being on the commission, is a contact sport. In other words, there's always somebody who's got something against whatever you're doing. And in doing so, you get somebody's ire up. We've been in meetings where the floors are stamped on, the people give you cat calls, the whole schmear. We've had to call the cops, you know, that's part of P&Z. It's a contact sport. It's where the action is, though. P&Z, I think, did a very good job in the 70s and 80s to bring the potential down so that what you see now is a better looking post road. It looks different. It's got landscaping that it never had before. People are beginning, when we first put in landscaping, they said you can't do that. We said, oh yes you can. You can't get your permits if you don't put the landscaping in. Oh, I'll put it in later. No, 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 no. We want the plan before we give you the permit. And they were fighting us all the way.
Who innovated the greening of the post road?
That is Eloise Ray.
Eloise Ray.
And the
because
Women's
that
Club.
Was an extraordinary effort.
And the
because
P&Z
it was a volunteer effort.
And the P&Z
but it was
accepted
under
it.
your
Yeah, but Mary Jenkins and Fran Cowden had written a paper on how the post road could be greened.
Yes.
And they sort of started it all, and they were both League people, by the way. That paper got a lot of attention, and I think it inspired both the Women's Club and Eloise Ray to start that. The Women's Club carried it on. There was a whole committee, greening of the post road. And then they came to me when I was in office. They said, we've done the post road. What do you want us to do? And I said, do Main Street. And then Main Street got trees.
Every day when you drive down the post road, you can see the impact that these visionary women had on our town and our quality of life. Westporters also played a role in the state and national league, and this involvement led, in one case in particular, to an opportunity on the international stage.
When I went on the state league board, there was a woman named Kay Phelps. She lived in Greenwich, but she came to Connecticut from Vermont. In Vermont, they had some sort of School of International Relations, and Kay decided we had to have one in Connecticut.
After establishing the Symposium on International Relations, Martha was asked to organize the League event to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the League and the 25th anniversary of the United Nations. On their way to the League's National Convention in Washington, D.C., hundreds of delegates from around the country stopped in at the UN for the day to hear speakers from around the world.
At the end of the convention, Ruth Hannafeld asked if I would be interested in being more involved with the UN, that she was looking for her alternate. All of that led through the years to Ruth becoming president of the League, National League, and I becoming the UN observer. And one day, we were remembering that great UN stopover and decided we'd have another big meeting at the UN. And we're hoping we have 200 or 300 people from New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York. And we ended up with 1,800 people. It was a really great day. It was the largest non-UN meeting that had ever happened at the UN. They were absolutely blown away. I had been at the League, been at the UN for some years as a volunteer for the League, representing the League. And David Exley, this wonderful man from New Zealand who was the head of public affairs, said, well, would you think of coming to work for the UN? Yes, I certainly would. And 9 months later, and I did, and went to work for the UN, which was really a incredibly wonderful experience. But it would never have happened without the League of Women Voters.
While the Westport League had an impact on individual members like Martha, it also exerted an influence on the internal affairs of the national organization. Always concerned with issues of fairness and equality, Westport led the charge for a major change in the policies of the National League.
Way back in the very early 70s, maybe 69, 70, 71, there were a couple of really faithful men who came to all of our units, and they would be the participants in the debate, and they would listen to the discussion, and they would offer their point of view, but they were not allowed to vote because men did not have voting rights in the League of Women Voters.
I made it very clear to friends of ours who were in the League of Women Voters that I thought this organization discriminated against men, that they only had women, and I couldn't be a member, and that was a standing joke.
And a bunch of us said, you know, that's really not appropriate. Here we are out there protesting. Women should have full voting rights. Women should have full access to jobs, and there shouldn't be a glass ceiling. And yet, here we are, a group of women saying it's okay to let men be second-class citizens in the League of Women Voters. So we took a vote, and I went to the National Convention.
That was the convention where the big issue was whether or not the League of Women Voters of the United States, the League of Women Voters, would allow men to be members.
And we mounted a campaign called Male Suffrage 1972. And we brought little buttons with us, and we handed them out all over the convention. There must have been 2,000 people at this convention. And we had to speak, we had a caucus, we had to do the whole thing.
And it hung on many small details, whether they could be members, full members, associate members, whether the name should be changed.
And sure enough, the League decided, yep, maybe we better let men have voting rights in the League. And at the time, the speaker, the big main speaker, was Gloria Steinem. And Gloria Steinem stood up, and I'll never forget it, and she said, well, I understand you've decided to let men have voting rights in the League of Women Voters. Well, you make sure you make them the secretaries. But we did make men full voting members of the League of Women Voters, and I'm proud to have been part of that passionate push.
It gave me a sense of the power, because we were making a tremendous change. We were making a big national statement. People were paying attention to us. It did make a big difference, because we hadn't been brought up to that. I certainly wasn't brought up at St. Agnes High School. They didn't teach us how to do that, I can tell you.
In the 1960s and 70s, the Westport League participated in many national studies on the social and political issues of the day. But the issue of civil rights was more than a national study topic, as the local league became involved in one of the most controversial and important social debates ever seen in our town.
I think the biggest effort the league ever made was in 1969, 1970, when the league human resources person named Elaine Gross got very interested in Project Concern. Now, Project Concern was a program in which was already in existence in West Hartford and in Wilton, Connecticut. And it was a program in which inner city children were bused to suburban schools for an education. And so the Board of Education started to talk about it. And meanwhile, the league started to hold meetings everywhere in town. Coffees, teas, just general meetings, talking about the possibility of Project Concern.
And we at League thought this was a really good idea. And so we began to talk about it. And And I'm not going to remember the exact dates of any of this, but I know I talked to over 30 groups, you know, Rotaries and, you know, every darn thing. And every single time, there was no exception, every time I spoke, somebody would ask this question. Well, how are these kids going to feel after they've come to Westport and see how we live? Everybody was like terrified of armed insurrection or something, you know.
And the League was absolutely sterling because we stood up for what we thought.
It was because League had a national position of equality of opportunity in education, employment, and housing.
And we had been going through study at that time on Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, so we had learned a lot about inequalities.
We had had the experience of having children from inner cities come to Westport for beach school, and there had been quite a fight about that within the town of Westport. But nobody predicted what developed when we started to discuss Project Concern. It was a huge and very bitter and very nasty fight.
Project Concern was probably one of the most difficult, confrontational, downright ugly things that have happened in Westport in the years since I've been here. To think about it now, it seems quite, it just does not seem possible that people behaved the way they did.
Project Concern was a major civil war in town. I think, looking back, that was the worst one. That was a real bloodbath.
It didn't matter that these children's parents had to give permission for them to be bused. It didn't matter that it wasn't going to cost the town of Westport. Bridgeport would pay for it. It didn't matter that class sizes would not change or get bigger. None of those things mattered. It just became very bitter, rather violent, very threatening to certain people. And it went on for months.
Well, the town went wild. There were meetings where people stood up and talked about the way of their lives being destroyed.
Finally, there was a huge meeting in Staples High School auditorium, absolutely filled, the school board running the meeting. And the school board voted and approved Project Concern. I was one of the first people to stand up and speak at that meeting. And I can't remember what I said, but I do remember that the next day, bright and early, Joan Shine, the chairman of the Board of Education, called me up and said, "You were wonderful." She said, "You had the effect of calming the crowd." She said that the League of Women Voters was just played such an important part in holding all these meetings and in educating the citizens.
That's one of the times that Westport League of Women Voters really made an impact because we were well respected. We were a very large membership in those days, and people listened to us. And when we spoke, people heard.
Politically, socially, and personally, the League of Women Voters has made many positive contributions to the town. Over the course of several decades in Westport, it has supported progressive changes in Westport while nurturing the great leadership potential of the women who have served it. It has been, in fact, a league of our own.
So it all began with the League, and I think for many of the women it did. It's amazing how it served that role, that interim role for many women, I think, who needed, we all needed the encouragement, or most of us did, and we got it there. I really am deeply grateful to it.
So for me it was extraordinary, all of these experiences, which I really, really attribute to the League of Women Voters. They got me started, taught me what I learned, you know.
My political philosophy really came from being in League, and you know, and I still treasure that. I still feel that's what I was grown up on.
Those were the days when becoming involved with the League, becoming involved with the town, gave women who didn't have professional, paid jobs, it gave us a resume.
Have we come a long way? Yes. Comparatively speaking, we have. Do we have a long way to go? Yes. If we can continue to engage ourselves in the issues of the day, if we continue to step forward and be educated in the areas that matter most to us, whether it's through the League or otherwise, then maybe when we do things, we will not be the first woman to do it. We will be the 20th woman, and it will be no big deal that there's another woman in the Supreme Court. It will be no big deal, and there should be no big deal, because God gave us all the same brains.
What was the women's movement? Some people saw it as a civil rights movement. Some people saw it as a political movement. I consider myself a woman who just wanted to be treated equally. And I think a lot of the League members, while they weren't activists in the movement, were again this quiet determination of having the right to be part of the system and not having to explain yourself because you're a woman. They were before the bra burners, let me put it that way. They just quietly infiltrated the system and said, I can do this, I know I'm a woman. They just infiltrated and said, yes, we can do this. And they did. And I'm proud to be part of that. I think it really, it means a lot to me to have been part of that.